Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeb Brown.
I'm Karina.
I'm Chris. And I'm Brian.
Carrie could not be here today. He is in class right now, so we're just going to do a practice without him. So in this presentation, we're going to tell you a little bit about the life of Bobby Dodd, which seems to be a popular subject among this class, the story of Eddie McAshan, and then the relevance of the items we chose to those two topics. So first, we're going to talk about Bobby Dodd a little bit. And we're going to start with his hiring. So he was hired in 1945 after being an assistant coach for a number of years under Coach Alexander. And this marked the beginning of a new era for Tech football, because before that it was very dictatorial, as other groups said. Especially with John Heisman, he was very on top of his players, and Coach Alexander was very much the same way. But Bobby Dodd coached differently. He was much more in tune with how the players wanted to be treated, because he played at UT Knoxville, and it talks about how after he got out of college, Georgia Tech turned him down for a coaching position, but in 1945, obviously they needed him, so they hired him, and he brought them a lot of success on the football field and outside the football field. So my second item is an article about a Christmas gift that the Georgia Tech football team got for Bobby Dodd. And it really shows a lot of the respect and admiration that the football team had for him, especially during this time, which was a year, 1946. He was being offered jobs at a lot of other universities to coach football. And so it shows how much the players and other coaches of Georgia Tech really wanted Bobby Dodd there, because he was such a positive impact on the team. And it shows that, and it says here that Mr. Dodd was flabbergasted and thankful, which are two great words. He obviously cared a great deal about the Georgia Tech football team, and so he poured his heart and his soul into the team for 23 years.
So my first item is the 1952 championship, and this was the first championship that Georgia Tech had won under Bobby Dodd as head coach, and this was a significant milestone in his career as a coach. It was his first extremely significant impact, accomplishment, and it just changed Georgia Tech football. I'm sure Bobby Dodd was questioned when he first came into the position, because he had a very different coaching approach as the previous two coaches, and I'm sure that this was a way to cement his legacy as one of the all-time great coaches of Georgia Tech. He was a lot more in tune with the players, as Jeb said, a lot more understanding, wasn't super hard on them, and they respected him more because he got to know them on a deeper level, really connected with his players, and they all respected him more and were willing to work hard for him, and it seemed to make for a very cohesive team, very cohesive unit that helped Georgia Tech to become successful and win this championship. And these two pictures, this first one is a picture of the 1952 football team getting on the plane to go to one of their games. And this second one is actually very interesting. It is a rat cap that was created the year of the championship in 1952 by one of only two women who enrolled in Georgia Tech that year. So that's very significant. That's very cool, I think. Only two women in the entire 1952 enrolling class, and this is one of the rat caps that they made. You see a lot of W's on there, obviously, with the championship. It's a good artifact to remember that year. And my second item is when Georgia Tech actually dropped out of the SEC to move to the ACC. I'm sure not many people realize that Georgia Tech at one point was a part of the SEC, and this came about because Bobby Dodd felt that the SEC had very relaxed and very unregulated rules on the football teams, particularly with recruiting. He felt that teams were able to cheat a little bit and kind of sway the rules in their favor to be able to make it a little unfair when recruiting players. He especially got into big arguments and had a big conflict with Bear Bryant in Alabama, as he felt that they were one of the main teams to not follow these rules and to really, he felt that like they were really cheating in their favor and making themselves a little bit better than everyone else just by not following the rules. So he switched to the ACC, and at the time, I'm sure he was happy about it. He got in a conference with a lot stricter rules, a lot more regulated, but down the line today, I think it probably hurt Georgia Tech a little bit. If Georgia Tech was still part of the ACC or was still part of the SEC, they would probably be a bit better in football. SEC is just the nature of the conference. The SEC is a lot higher performing in many sports, and just if Georgia Tech was still in the SEC, they would be forced to play up to those standards, up to like bigger teams like UGA, Alabama, Florida. There are a lot bigger teams in the SEC than the ACC. So Georgia Tech would likely be a better program for athletics if they were to stay in the SEC, but unfortunately they are not.
So one of the last items we found on Bobby Dodd were these 3 handwritten notes, and these are just manuscripts of them to make them more legible. And they're very interesting because it shows his emotion and his really personal touch on how sad he was to have to leave because of his health. So he obviously retired in 1967, and these notes, I think, just really show his legacy and how respected he was among the players and the coaches. And it says that he wasn't even he wasn't even able to talk, to tell his own players that he was leaving, and he had to get someone else to read these notes to them. So I just think that really shows his impact on Tech as a whole.
Great, so now we're going to be talking about the story of Eddie McShawn, who is one of the most influential players in all of Georgia Tech football history. So the first item I'm going to be talking about is how Eddie McShawn was actually kicked off the Liberty Bowl roster. This is one of the most important bowl games of the entire season, and in 1972, only a day before the actual game, Eddie McShawn was kicked off the roster citing personal reasons on behalf of the coach, who was Fulcher, and Eddie McShawn himself. Both cited personal reasons. However, many outside parties actually looked deeper into these comments, and it was revealed that there's actually racist motivations behind his suspension, and it was a very significant moment because Eddie McShawn was only the second African-American quarterback at a major southeastern university. And yeah, so this is the first step in what establishes Eddie McShawn's legacy here at Georgia Tech.
So next, he actually had a 5-minute prepared statement on the racism he was experiencing, and this is an article published in 1972 that kind of recounts that occurrence. And he talked about experiencing vandalism to his property and fireworks in his dorm, just things like that, how the players weren't accepting him onto the team, and he still had to undergo this racist behavior. So one of the quotes I found interesting was, he kind of summarized this in saying that this experience clearly indicates that in spite of my performance in the final analysis, I'm still a black man. And I thought it was just very interesting that this football program that's so glorified in Tech's history also has this controversial side that less people know about.
Carrie?
Yeah, this is Carrie.
So this is Carrie's slide.
Okay, so the second item I'm going to analyze was titled Black Swear Bans in the Liberty Protest. And so this was the game. This article was published the day after the game, and the African American players on both Iowa's side and Georgia Tech side both wore black bands around their arms to indicate support for Eddie McShawn's protest against the football program at Georgia Tech and the racism that he was encountering every day. And it's actually very reflective of, you could draw parallels between this experience and today, because people were arguing over whether or not a football game was the correct platform for some form of social activism, and there's a lot of controversy in this article about it. And so one of the quotes is they were not wearing the armbands in protest, but as an act of sympathy. I think the appropriate place for them to do it is the Liberty Bowl, which was obviously a very controversial opinion both then and now. You could find the same thing.
Terry, slide. So in conclusion, by telling the stories of both of these men, we can know more about Georgia Tech's football history. Most of the old Georgia Tech football history is very great and it's glorified, but through the story of Eddie McShawn, you can see that there's also a controversial side. But you can know that because of this controversial side, Georgia Tech is kind of at the forefront of transforming the culture, especially in regards to civil rights, because we are in Atlanta, which is the birthplace of the civil rights movement. So we can see from the past, we can see how things will play out in the future, how Georgia Tech can be at the forefront of issues like this, and maybe hopefully one day become the football program that we were back in the early 1950s and 60s.
So we'll probably finish the presentation by just showing our site. We have the 2 collections and all the items. We also have a photo gallery with just some still images we were able to find in the archives. Yep, and then we'll ask if there's any questions. So